After losing my parents in an accident and growing up in a foster care facility, I couldn't find any meaning in living or reason to try hard. Then one day, I received a letter from my mother, who was supposed to be dead. Moreover, it was sent to the house where I lived with my parents. This couldn't possibly be happening. But maybe. After days of agonizing, I decided to head to the address on the letter. However, standing in front of my childhood home, I suddenly became terrified. So, I decided to peek into the backyard. Gently peering in, I saw a middle-aged couple living there. I strained my eyes to observe further. I thought if they were complete strangers, I would sneak away. But the next moment, I doubted my own eyes. Wait! Dad, Mom! I was stunned by this unexpected turn of events. My name is Karen. I was placed in a child welfare facility when I was 10 and left 2 years ago. Currently, I'm living alone in a cheap apartment in the city, juggling multiple part-time jobs. My parents died in a car accident when I was 10. During the summer break, we were involved in a pileup on the highway. I was also in the car, but miraculously survived because I was sitting in the back seat. However, my parents, who were in the front, lost their lives upon colliding with a truck ahead due to the impact of the pileup. That day was my birthday celebration, and we were returning from a leisure pool I had always wanted to visit. Suddenly, as I was dozing off, I felt a shock as if a cannon had been fired, and the next moment, I couldn't move. With no sense of time, I desperately called out to my father and mother. But I received no response from them and lost consciousness, waking up later in a hospital bed. As soon as the nurses realized I was awake, they started bustling about, and soon, police officers and doctors began to enter the room. All the while, I wondered when my parents would come. I asked the nurses several times, "Where are Dad and Mom?" But only got vague answers that made no sense to me. As a 10-year-old, I thought they must be hospitalized elsewhere. However, a few days later, I learned what those vague answers meant. A woman who said she was my mother's sister came and told me that my parents' injuries were fatal, and there was no hope for their survival. Moreover, she said she had her own family and couldn't take care of me. I couldn't grasp the situation at all. My mother's sister explained things to me in simple terms, making it clear that once I was discharged, I would be going to a foster care facility. I had many questions about what would happen to our house, my school, etc., but I felt slightly relieved at the prospect of not becoming part of a stranger's family. I remember that feeling well. After my injuries healed and I became mobile, I went to the foster care facility without returning home. My mother's sister had taken care of the funeral and sorted through our belongings while I was hospitalized, and my things were sent to the facility. We had been corresponding by letter since I was in the hospital, so I was informed of this in advance. To be honest, it felt like strangers were rummaging through our home, which I disliked, but there was nothing a 10-year-old me could do about it. I never imagined I wouldn't be able to return home. I wanted to know why but didn't know whom to ask or how to express it. Everything progressed without my consent, and I just went along with it. Those were my days. Even after entering the foster care facility, I received a few letters a year from my mother's sister, but the content was always the same. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" At first, I responded, but soon ran out of things to write. So, gradually, I stopped replying to the letters I received. I had never met my mother's sister before my parents' death, so she was like a stranger to me. I didn't feel anything being worried about by a stranger, and the letter exchange felt like a hassle. Perhaps she sensed my feelings because the letters from my mother's sister gradually decreased over the years. By the time I left the foster care facility, I had almost forgotten about the letters, becoming distant. I always felt as if I had been left behind in an unknown world, spending my days in the foster care facility. Because the funeral was over while I was hospitalized and I came to the facility without ever returning home, it felt like the reality of the situation never fully set in.
Why am I even here?
I always felt this sense of alienation deep inside me. And as I grew older, this feeling of being an outsider turned into a sense of loneliness that stayed with me. I have nothing left. There's no point in trying when there's nothing there. That's how I came to despise everything and lost all motivation. So, after graduating high school and leaving the facility to find a job, I couldn't fit in with the atmosphere at work or bridge the gap with those around me, leading me to quit shortly after. I became a freelancer, but I never felt like I belonged anywhere, and none of the jobs lasted long. The intervals between finding new work grew longer, and my already meager savings quickly depleted. I was living day to day on what little I could earn from temporary part-time jobs, barely managing to keep myself fed. Is there really a point to living this lonely existence? Would it be easier just to leave my apartment and live on the streets? I pondered this idea many times, but always stopped short at the last moment. I thought that my parents would be sad if they knew I was living on the streets. Even though I knew I could never see them again, I didn't want to do anything that would make them sad. One day, when I was exhausted from this daily struggle, I received a message that a letter addressed to me had arrived at the foster care facility I had left. Perhaps due to the guilt of quitting my job soon after starting, I had been avoiding any contact with the facility. So, I intended to ask them to dispose of the letter without reading it. However, the moment I heard who the letter was from, I was shocked. It was from my mother, who was supposed to have died in an accident when I was 10. I immediately went to the facility to collect the letter. My mind was a mess ever since I received the call. My parents died in an accident when I was 10. That was an unchangeable fact. So, miracles don't happen, and the letter must be some kind of mistake. I tried hard to calm myself down, not wanting to indulge in escapism. But contrary to my efforts, the irrational hope that perhaps the report of their deaths was a mistake kept surfacing in my mind. If my mother was alive, why had she left me in the facility all these years? What does sending a letter now change? As I rode the train to the facility, I kept pondering these questions. But I couldn't come to a satisfying conclusion or sort out my feelings by the end. Instead, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion, joy, questions, anger, and sadness, feeling like I might burst into tears at any moment. When I finally arrived at the facility after more than an hour, my mind was blank from overthinking. Let's just see the actual letter before I think any further, I muttered to myself as I entered the facility. After receiving the letter in the office, I stared intently at the writing on the envelope. It was unmistakably my deceased mother's handwriting, and the sender was indeed my mother. Hesitantly opening the envelope, I found 3 letters inside, each adorned with illustrations of a character I loved when I was 10. And at the beginning of the first letter, it read, "To Karen, now 20 years old." Just looking at my mother's soft, slightly quirky handwriting made my chest tight and my eyes well up with tears. The letters, overflowing with memories of my life up until I was 10 and imaginings of how I might grow and live in the next decade, felt exactly like my mother herself. I looked up at the ceiling several times to prevent my tears from wetting the letter. Yet, the tears that flowed were unstoppable, dampening parts of the letter. After reading the letters, I thanked the staff at the facility and quickly left. My mind was still too chaotic to engage in conversation with anyone. As I rode the train home, I read and reread the letter, feeling as if I might grasp something by doing so. And as a result, I concluded that this letter was written before the accident. My mother must have written this letter as a commemoration of my turning 10 and filled it with hopes and thoughts for my future 10 years later. The question was, who sent it? The first person that came to mind was my mother's sister. But it's been years since we became estranged, and I can't see why someone would go to the trouble of sending a letter in my mother's name. Plus, the return address was the house where I lived when I was 10. If my mother's sister was the sender, she would have used her own name and address. Since we've grown so distant that I've almost forgotten about her, I doubt she even remembers me. I wondered who else it could be, but no one came to mind. The resemblance of my mother in the letter filled me with happiness and confusion. What's the right way to feel? What am I supposed to do after reading this? No matter how much I thought, I couldn't find an answer. Exhausted from thinking, I decided to put the letter away in a drawer and return to my everyday life as if nothing had happened. However, as days passed, the existence of the letter nagged at me incessantly. I even considered throwing it away, but seeing my mother's handwriting on the envelope, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Then, I thought about going to meet the sender of the letter. After all, I have nothing left to lose. And maybe, just maybe, I could ask the sender for help with my life. Unconsciously, I might have been expecting something from the letter's sender that could change my current life. On the train to the nostalgic address, I gazed absently at the streets, so different from my memories. Where there used to be rice fields and forests, now stood a large shopping center and numerous houses. The station I alighted at had a completed bus rotary and even a stylish cafe. Walking towards the address in the letter, I wondered if this too was a world unknown to me. However, a few minutes later, as I turned a corner, the scene that unfolded before me took my breath away. It was the residential area from my memories, almost unchanged from 10 years ago. That view instantly transported me back to the world of 10 years prior. This was undoubtedly the street I used to live on. Our family's house was just ahead. Before I knew it, I was running towards the house. Filled with a strange sense of reassurance, like a school kid returning home or a long-lost child finally finding their way back. At the end of my frantic run, I found my beloved home, just as I remembered it. Indeed, the letter had been sent from my house. But standing in front of the house, I couldn't muster the courage to press the doorbell. The fear of the unknown outweighed my desire to uncover the truth, freezing me in place. After pondering what to do, I decided to take a look around the backyard first. Peeking into the yard, feeling somewhat uneasy about my burglar-like actions, I saw a middle-aged couple preparing for sunbathing on the balcony. The man seemed to be in a wheelchair. I continued to observe them to see if they were people I knew. While their calm voices barely reached me, their faces turned in my direction for a moment. The moment I saw their faces, I involuntarily exclaimed,
Wait! Dad, Mom! You're kidding, right?
As I stood there in shock, the man in the wheelchair noticed me. Karen? He murmured my name and suddenly started crying out loud. Meanwhile, I was so overwhelmed by the turn of events that I was paralyzed. Then, sensing something was wrong, a woman rushed out from the house onto the balcony. She ran straight to the man in the wheelchair and spoke to him. Through his tears, he pointed at me and said something to the woman. She looked at me intently, then smiled and said,
You're Karen, right? There's something I'd like to talk about. Would you come inside?
Inviting me into the house. Though I was still confused, I had many questions of my own. I nodded silently and was led to the living room. The woman introduced herself as Jane. And the man in the wheelchair was indeed my father, Mike. They were married and now lived in this house alone. According to Jane, my father was critically injured and comatose after the accident, hovering between life and death. I was supposed to have been informed of this as a 10-year-old, but I had no memory of it. When I told Jane this, she asked, How were you told? That his condition was hopeless. I relayed what my mother's sister had told me. But upon reflection, I realized I had only heard of my mother's death. If so, why was my father considered dead? With Jane's help, I spent hours reconciling my memories with the truth. As a result, I realized I had made a huge misunderstanding. Unable to comprehend that my father was in a coma after the accident, as a 10-year-old, I developed a one-sided resentment towards him for never coming to see me. Dad never comes to visit. It must be because he's mad at me for wanting to go to the leisure pool. That's why Mom died. That's how I felt, believing that my father had come to dislike me. And somehow, that morphed into the belief that both my parents had died in the accident. I guess it was less painful for you at the time to think that both had passed away, rather than feeling disliked by Dad, Jane suggested, but I was filled with remorse towards my father. Yet, I also had questions. It was terrifying to ask, but I knew I'd regret it if I stayed silent. I gathered my courage and asked Jane, "Why didn't Dad come to pick me up?" Jane paused to think for a moment, then subtly signaled to my father. Without saying anything, he nodded, and Jane began to explain the situation back then. Mike regained consciousness more than half a year after the accident. Half a year. That coincided with the time I was discharged from the hospital. He miraculously woke up, but it took him several more months to grasp his situation. Imagine waking up feeling like you've just slept through the night, only to find out half a year has passed. It's understandable. Furthermore, my father was left with numerous disabilities in his memory, speech, and body due to the aftereffects of the accident. Doctors had told him that returning to his previous life was impossible. My mother's sister, having heard that recovery was hopeless, proceeded with the arrangements for my admission to the foster care facility as planned. By the time I woke up, there was nothing left. The length and importance of the time I lost while asleep hit me painfully. My father said, his eyes brimming slightly with tears. Jane explained that after being discharged, my father was admitted to the disability care facility where she worked. Even though he wanted to see you, Karen, there was a time when he couldn't speak properly to convey his feelings. At the same time, he began to accept that Mary had passed away, leading Mike into a deep depression that required psychiatric hospitalization. Everyone had lost everything, and like me, my father had been searching for a reason to live amid despair. Hearing this story made me feel incredibly relieved. My father hadn't disliked or forgotten about me. On the contrary, he was so distressed over me that he became mentally ill. Feeling this, a strange warmth began to melt the cold loneliness in my heart. According to Jane, even after returning from the psychiatric ward to the facility, my father's emotional state remained unstable. He refused rehabilitation, didn't eat, and had many incidents of lashing out at staff or throwing things because he couldn't communicate his desires. As the staff's treatment of him gradually became more procedural amidst this neglect, Jane was the one who consistently engaged with him without showing any displeasure. Jane used homemade cards and whiteboards to understand what he wanted to communicate, gave him daily massages to prevent his muscles from stiffening, and visited to practice conversation whenever she could find the time. My father said to Jane, "I see Mary's reflection in you. I thought Mary would be sad to see me like this, so I felt I had to try harder." As he held Jane's hand, it was clear how important Jane had become to my father. I felt a tinge of jealousy towards them. I wished I had someone to support me like that. Later, my father transformed, diligently attending rehabilitation every day and stopping all aggressive behavior towards the staff. The man who initially wouldn't even try to get out of bed at the facility began to go to the rehab room on his own and voluntarily work out. It sounded like a miracle just hearing about it. But the real miracle was yet to come. Thanks to his desperate efforts in rehabilitation, my father recovered enough to lead a normal life and was able to leave the disability facility.
The doctors were amazed, saying they had never seen anyone recover like that.
My father said with a hint of pride. Next to him, Jane smiled happily. Her smile, so reminiscent of my late mother, enveloped my heart in a strange, nostalgic warmth. Yet, I hadn't asked about the letter from my mother. Pulling the letter from my bag, I inquired about its origin. Suddenly, my father grew silent and looked down. Seeing this, Jane stepped in to explain on his behalf. After we got married, I found this letter while tidying up the room. Mike had always thought of you but felt he had no right to see her, believing he had avoided you long enough. I convinced him that at least the letter should be sent. Jane's explanation helped piece together the jumbled puzzle in my mind. It all seemed like a twist of fate. My father, unable to visit me due to the accident and his disabilities. Me, mistakenly believing my father was dead. Both of us had been walking through life feeling lonely and overshadowed by darkness. But it was Jane and the letter left by my mother that brought us together. I never forgot about you, Karen, but I felt too guilty for not being able to do anything for so long. I worried that contacting you now would only be a bother. I'm truly sorry. My father apologized. Hearing about his struggles and guilt, I couldn't feel anything but happiness, knowing he had always thought of me. The fact that we both reached a point of despair, at the same time, strangely affirmed our bond as parent and child, almost making me laugh. Sharing this with Jane and my father, they both cried and laughed. It was the first time I saw such warm tears. Glancing outside, I noticed the sunset on the balcony. Announcing it was time for me to leave, I stood up. My father urgently asked me to wait.
Please wait. Now that we've finally met, I don't want to leave you alone again. I might not have the right to say this now, but I want us to be a family again. Stay here, Karen.
He pleaded with tears. I was thrilled to hear how much he cared, but also worried about disrupting the happiness he had with Jane. Torn between refusing and wanting to stay with my father, I was paralyzed. I couldn't find the words to respond, standing frozen. If I were your mom, do you think I would refuse? Jane asked unexpectedly. Surprised, I looked directly at her. Jane smiled at me gently, as if she understood my hesitations. Her smile and her kind, considerate nature reminded me so much of my mother. It felt as if my real mother was encouraging me. And that gave me the courage to be true to my feelings.
If you're okay with someone like me, please let me be part of your family.
I answered loudly, and my father joyously reacted as if he might leap out of his wheelchair. His happiness made me laugh loudly for the first time in 10 years. I had finally found my place in the world where I belonged. Half a year later, I'm now studying hard to become a flight attendant, a dream of mine. Next year, I plan to take the entrance exams for a specialized school. Before coming back here, I had lost all motivation and given up on thinking about my dreams and future. But reuniting with my father allowed me to consider my future again, guided once more by my mother's letter. In it, she had written, "What are you doing now? Did you become a flight attendant like you dreamed? No matter the future, Mom is cheering for you, Karen." Holding on to my mother's kind thoughts, I've decided to pursue my dreams. And someday, I secretly plan to repay my father and Jane with my first salary.